welcome to my third Grace Grid blog video. I want to continue in just sort of a basic overview of my topics in my book Grace Grid. If you'd like a copy, I'll put some links of where you can get it digitally or as a hard copy online. Last video we talked a little bit about Scripture and its primary place in the teachings of the church and in the people of God. So if you'd like, you can check that out. Today, I want to go a little bit further and talk about the second chapter, which is really about the doctrine of God. I started with Scripture because that's where we derive our authority as we speak about God, and now I want to dig in a little bit about that. Just like the last video, though, I'm not going to do an overview of the actual chapter. The chapter really is about the characteristics of God, the attributes of God, His omniscience, His omnipotence, what we usually think of when we think about the attributes of God. And I also talk a bit about the Trinity in the book. So again, if you want the book, you can take a look at it. But taking that chapter as a whole, I sort of want to take that idea of our doctrine of God and talk about the place that takes in the way that we think about the Christian life. So today, I'm going to start with a little something new. I have my marker board today. Might need to do a graph or something. But really I find that there's three areas that we think about when we think about the ministry of the church and the ministry between the people of God. The first thing we need to think about is our theology. The second is our anthropology, and the third is our methodology. Now, basically, however you think about those words, the way I define them basically is theology is obviously our doctrine of God, our anthropology is our doctrine of man, and our methodology is how we live those things out. And I find that there's different emphasis people place on these different topics. And I think there's really only one correct order in which we should emphasize these. I find that in the church today, at least in the circles I've grown up in, if there's ever a faulty way in which these are thought of, in my circles the fault tends to be that man is placed first. So I'd say a very popular way of ordering these is that you start with anthropology, the doctrine of man. Then second, you have the doctrine of God, your theology. And then finally from that you derive your methodology. So as you can see, anthropology, our doctrine of man, usually comes first. And then underneath those, you see that our theology and our methodology flow. What happens when you do this is that God really only becomes as big as your doctrine of man. You start to use illustrations, you start to use ways of thinking to define God, really that only rise as high as your view of man. And God becomes much more human in the way He looks. Another improper way of emphasizing these different points is that you might put your methodology first, and out of that will flow your doctrine of man and your doctrine of God. When this happens, very often people are not loved the way they should be, and ultimately God is not loved the way He should be loved. There's usually a system of church government, a system of thought, a system of relating with people that puts really just our methods and our way of living first and foremost, and it becomes much more ritualistic, and really our traditions, whether biblical or not, become the main focus, and people and God are de-emphasized. And ultimately, once God is de-emphasized, you've missed the boat completely in regard to the church and the Christian life. Now, while there's those faulty ways of thinking, those ultimately false ways of thinking in how we emphasize human beings and how we emphasize God and how we emphasize our actions and our methodology, the true way that we need to think about things is that, this may seem like common sense to so many of us, but it really needs to be said. The proper way in order in which we should think is that our theology needs to determine our anthropology and our methodology. Really, I should draw the chart like this, in that theology comes first and it flows down as a result of the way we think about God, we think about man, our anthropology. And therefore, human beings are not made so much of that they compete with with God, but they're also not degraded because we see that we're made in the image of God. And then out of that flows our methodology and how we minister to people. So theology, anthropology, methodology is the correct order. One of the reasons I really wanted to talk about this today is that there's a very popular church. If you want the names involved and all of that, I'll put a link to my my blog, a recent blog post that I did, and then you can read up on it. But I found that in this church, what happened was the first error that I talked about is that anthropology had been put first for a long, long time. I heard it in the way things were taught there, and ultimately what happens when you do that is God again begins to get smushed down into pretty much as big as our thoughts about man are. Our doctrine of man determines our doctrine of God when that happens. And what happened was a teacher stood up and he denied something that we'll be talking about hopefully in the next video in the doctrine of man. He denied that man was born sinful, which is a very, very central idea in the way that we think about the gospel. Ultimately, when we see God first in our theology and think about Him properly in His holiness, His righteousness, His love, all those things in their proper categories, then we think about man, we see the contrast, as it's pointed out in Scripture. And therefore, we don't limit God to the way that we think about man. But in this church, this teacher, he ultimately denied that man was born sinful. He denied many of the things that Christ accomplished on the cross, the way that it affected the heart of God, the way that it affected man. And ultimately, it was a very sad thing, and I felt compelled to write this blog post, which I did, and you can read it. That's just an example of what I'm talking about. That when a church or a people takes their doctrine of man and they elevate it and emphasize it more than their doctrine of God, eventually God is going to be squeezed into your doctrine of man, or something's going to be changed, something's going to be skewed. And ultimately what we saw here was man was elevated to a place where he really is not. Things were said about man that really were not true, and things were said about God that ultimately were not true. His love was emphasized over his justice is ultimately what happened. So anyways, I hope this has been helpful. I hope this helps you to think about the way that you emphasize God. I hope that you'll continue to test yourself as I have to test myself all the time. Am I properly emphasizing the doctrine of our doctrine of God? Am I properly thinking about man? Am I properly thinking about the way I live these truths out? And so next time we'll emphasize and talk about the doctrine of man. But I wanted to do the right thing and put this first, talk about theology first, and allow it to determine the rest of our discussions. So hope you'll keep watching. Hope you'll read my blog. Hope you'll join us next time on the Grace Grid channel. So thanks a lot. Have a great week.